The United States purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire, or Seward's Folly as it is known, was a pivotal moment in U.S. history. Just why did Russia sell Alaska to the United States in the first place? The United States was just emerging from the ashes of the bloody Civil War and engaged in the highly contentious post-war period of Reconstruction. The purchase of Alaska by Secretary of State William Seward was partially an attempt for the U.S. to rally together behind the shared interest in further expanding the country. While the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had already accomplished the dream of manifest destiny, Alaska was yet another nearby large territory for the United States to adopt and rule. Public opinion across the United States generally favored the purchase of Alaska, though a vocal minority loudly opposed it. In this case, the loudest voices echoed the most through history, and hence why the Alaska purchase has the nickname of Seward's Folly. The purchase was also unique in that it was the first time the U.S. had acquired land outside of the contiguous United States. The Alaska purchase raised the question of whether the U.S. was on its way to becoming an imperial power. President Ulysses S. Grant's failed bid to annex Santo Domingo in the 1870s increased the debate. The questions would further intensify with the annexation of Hawaii and the territories acquired following the Spanish-American War in 1898, after which the U.S. was undoubtedly an imperial power. Seward's Folly and the purchase of Alaska went on to play a major role in the economic, commercial, and strategic successes of the United States in the following decades. Russia sold Alaska to the United States primarily as it was in need of money following their disastrous defeat in the Crimean War. In addition, the Russian Tsar feared that British and American settlers would one day overrun the territory, particularly if they ever found valuable natural resources such as gold. The Russians first explored and settled Alaska in the early 18th century, though did not establish the first permanent settlement until 1784. The land became more sought after following explorer Vitus Bering's 1741 expedition. Bering died during the journey, though his crew brought back sea otter pelts along with their tales of the new lands they discovered. The new lands sparked interest, particularly the availability of animal furs, which brought forth the first Russian settlers to America. The Russians quickly subjugated the native Aleuts and forced many to hunt the sea otters and other animals. The Aleuts suffered under the harsh treatment, though the real killer came from European-introduced disease. As much as 75 to 90% of the Aleut population succumbed to European diseases and Russian aggression. 1 While the fur trade was the primary economic driver for Russian settlement, Alaska was very sparsely populated. There were never more than a few hundred Russians settled there at one time. The fur trade itself was barely profitable given the enormous transportation costs from the far-flung region. As Russia watched its competitors, the U.S. and Great Britain, begin to make their way westward across the American continent, they grew concerned that British or American settlers would one day overrun the territory, just like what happened during the Texas Revolution in the 1830s. Their concern grew even more upon the mad dash for gold in 1849 and the subsequent population boom of California. Russia knew if prospectors ever discovered gold in Alaska, the empire would have no hopes of stopping the influx of foreign settlers. After a sound defeat in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, Russia badly needed money and first proposed the sale of Alaska to the United States. The U.S. was receptive, though the Civil War brought the talks to a halt. Following the conclusion of the Civil War, Russia once again proposed selling Alaska to the United States. Then Secretary of State William Seward was an ardent expansionist and favored the purchase. He and President Andrew Johnson were mired in the difficulties of the Reconstruction era and sought a victory that all Americans could get behind. Negotiations resumed with Russian diplomat Eduard de Stoeckel in March 1867. On March 30, 1867, Seward and de Stoeckel struck a deal, the United States purchase of Alaska. The Senate later ratified the treaty on April 9 and President Johnson signed the treaty on May 28. The Alaska purchase added nearly 591,000 sq miles of territory to the United States, all at the bargain price of just $7.2 million, or roughly 2 cents per acre. It was the second largest addition of territory to the U.S. after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. While the Senate was pending ratification of the treaty, Seward and Johnson's opponents were having a field day. The critics slammed the deal, lambasting it as Seward's folly, Seward's icebox, and Johnson's polar bear garden, among other creative names. Despite this rhetoric, historical studies show that most newspapers and Americans either favored the Alaska Purchase or were at least not opposed to it. Supporters of the deal praised the expansionist action and foresaw the future strategic value of the land. The Russians officially transferred Alaska to the United States on October 18, 1867. An unintended outcome of the transfer was that Alaskans lost 11 days from their year in the process. At the time, Russia was still on the Julian calendar, while the U.S. used the Gregorian calendar. 12 total days separated the two calendars. Alaska now operated on the Gregorian calendar upon the sale. In the transfer, Alaska also moved from the European side to the American side of the international dateline, and therefore only lost 11 days from their year.